sing our opening song.
Hey, oh my goodness, who's there? We have a guest. Oh no.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Hi, neighbor.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Mr. Rodgers' neighborhood. For those of you who maybe didn't grow up in this country or don't know that much about him, Mr. Fred Rodgers was the very popular creator, composer, and host of a preschool television series entitled Mr. Rodgers' Neighborhood. And it ran for 33 years, from 1968 to 2001, basically Monday through Friday each day for about a half an hour. He would come sauntering into his studio, right, singing the song you just sang, take off his coat, put on one of his sweaters knitted by his mother, and he would take off his business shoes and put on his sneakers. It was a ritual that is recognizable as the man himself. And if you grew up as a child during that time, or as I did, or you had children who grew up during that time, you know who he is. Now, the target audience for his show was the preschool age, from about 2 to 5. Yet he would say to these children in a soft-spoken way, very deliberate way, what he would say was very profound. I think perhaps children weren't his only audience. He knew adults were watching with their kids. And he spoke most often about how you are loved just as you are. He said whether we're a preschooler or a young teen, a graduating college senior, or a retired person, we human beings all want to know that we're acceptable, that our being alive somehow makes a difference in the lives of others. He also talked a lot about emotions to young children, and which was unusual for a man in the 1960s. And in particular, he talked about love. He told us love isn't a state of perfect caring, it's an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is, right here and now. I gotta tell you, I've been learning a lot about him. The more I do, the more I consider him one of my great spiritual heroes. But I am only a recent fan. The biggest fan is our very own Dave Hardenbrook, who you all just met coming in here. He knows almost all the songs and stories from the show, and he and Amy Tompkins have a very special treat for you as our sort of joint musical affirmation in Time for All Ages. So I'd like to invite all of the children and children at heart up here to join Dave and Amy for this duet. Come on up here. Now, this song that they're singing was originally between Lady Aberlin, who you can see in the picture up here, a frequent guest on the show, and Daniel Tiger, also you see there, tame, mild tiger. And Daniel Tiger, like most of the puppets on the show, was voiced by Mr. Rodgers. And this is one of their famous duets.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm a mistake. I'm not like anyone else I know. When I'm asleep or even awake, sometimes I get to dreaming that I'm just a fake. I'm not like anyone else. Others I know are big and are wild. I
no mistaking it. You're my best friend. I think you are just fine as you are. I really must tell you I do like the person that you are becoming. When you are sleeping, when you are waking, you're not a fake, you're no mistake. You are my friend.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm
You
a
are just
mistake.
fine as you
I'm
are.
not like anyone else.
Really
I
must
know
tell you, I
when
do
I'm asleep
like
or
the person
even
that
awake.
you are
Sometimes I get to
becoming.
dreaming that I'm just a fake. I'm not like anyone
You
else.
are my friend. It's
Others
really
I know
true.
are big and are
I
wild.
like
I'm very
you.
small and quite tame.
Crying or shaking or
Most of
dreaming
the
or
time I'm
breaking,
mean
there's
and
no
I smile.
mistaking.
Do you
You're
suppose
my
that's a
best
shame?
friend.
Often I wonder if I'm
You
a
are just
mistake.
fine as you
I'm not
are.
supposed to be
I
scared,
really
am
must tell
I?
you, I
Sometimes I
do
cry
like the
and sometimes
person
I
that
shake,
you are
wondering
becoming.
isn't it true that the strong never break? I'm not like anyone else. I know I'm not like anyone
We love our kids just as they are. Let's sing them out to their religious education classes if they'd like to go.
Hold you in our love as you know, May your heart be at ease as you go. To nurture the spark of your precious heart, we hold you in our love as you go.
I'm going to start my day like that. So our reading today was written by Michael Long. It's actually not from this book. It was posted out on Huffington Post. Michael Long wrote this book about the sort of countercultural Mr. Rodgers. If you get a chance to read it, awesome book. It's really, really good. The title of this post that came out in Huffington Post was Mr. Rodgers Gay? So this is Michael Long's response. Wasn't he gay? That's what people often ask me when they learn that I'm working on a book about Fred Rodgers. I've come to believe that the question, however intended, reveals just as much about the questioners as it does about Rodgers. Sure, the question makes complete sense if a lack of machismo means that a man is gay. After all, Fred Rodgers was the opposite of macho. He showed no hint of physical brawn, his chin was weak, his muscles underdeveloped, and his face smooth. Nor was he aggressive. He talked softly, his spirit was gentle and tender, patient and trustworthy, and receptive and loving. A model of male softness and sensitivity on and off television. But wait a second. Lots of gay men are tough guys, muscular, aggressive, and downright rough. So the mere fact that Rodgers was the opposite of macho really proves nothing about his sexual orientations. The question, wasn't he gay, is also reasonable if gay men prefer that their friends and social groups be gay or at least gay-friendly. After all, Fred Rodgers knowingly hired gays to appear in Mr. Rodgers' neighborhood, counting even two of them as close friends, John Reardon and Francois Clemens. Rodgers also attended a Presbyterian church in Pittsburgh that remains well known for welcoming the LGBT community and supporting its full inclusion at all denominational levels. But wait another second. Isn't it true that some gay men don't use sexual orientation as the major criterion when selecting their best friends? And that other gay men even closely identify with institutions that are historically and vehemently anti-gay, like Catholic Church or conservative Protestant churches, and the Boy Scouts of America. If this is indeed true, then Rodgers' choices of friends and church also doesn't give us any firm evidence about his sexual orientation. The nagging question is also understandable if we acknowledge that gay men of Rodgers' generation often hid their sexuality by marrying women and having children, all the while engaging in gay sex on the sly. Rodgers was married to one woman, Joanne, for almost all his adult life, and their relationship, by all accounts, a loving and devoted one, resulted in the birth of 2 sons. But there's a significant point to add here. There is no publicly available evidence that Rodgers ever engaged in gay sex. None, zip, zilch, nothing there. Okay, but don't we also have to concede that some heterosexually married or single gay men, for a wide variety of reasons, don't engage in gay sex? And if this is the case, we're still left unsure about Rodgers' sexual orientation, much, I would suspect, as others are about, well, our orientations. Everything comes a bit more complicated when we consider that in the late 1960s, Rodgers encouraged Francois Clemens, who played the role of Officer Clemens, to remain in the closet, to marry a woman and focus on a singing career as ways to rein in and channel his gay sexual orientation. Rodgers evidently believed Clemens would tank his career, probably true, had he come out as a gay man in the late 1960s. But, and this is the crucial point, Rodgers later revised his counsel to his friend. As countless gays came out more publicly following the Stonewall Uprising, Rodgers even urged Clemens to enter into long-term and stable gay relationships. Nevertheless, Rodgers was never a public advocate of gay rights, even in the post-Stonewall era, and he told colleagues that a public stance on the issue would alienate many of the viewers he wanted to reach with his message. And what was that message? I like you just the way you are. Unconditional acceptance, arguably the most positive and compassionate message that any gay child, youth, or adult could find anywhere on television during Rodgers' reign. Perhaps it's this queer and straight-friendly message that we would do well to recall as we wonder about Rodgers' sexual orientation, revealing so many of our prejudices along the way, deep-seated prejudices about the lives of gays and straights, and about our own uneasiness with sexual orientations and behaviors. At last, perhaps we should turn the camera lens toward ourselves and assure Fred Rodgers that we like him just as he was, the opposite of machismo, a loving husband and father, a close friend and employer of gays, and above all else, a compassionate human being who assured each of us that no matter who we are or what we do, we are always and everywhere lovable and capable of loving anyone just as they are. I invite you into a moment of meditation to consider his words. Rodgers would end each program by telling his viewers, "You've made this day a special day by just being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are."
Our journeying song is How Could Anyone?
Mr. Rodgers' Neighborhood aired on public television between 1968 and 2001, as Reverend Sean mentioned. And I came of age along with the show, following it through all its years and all its various iterations of the opening credits. And if you look at the kind of the whole history of the show, there was kind of two basic eras to it. There was a lot of younger people are more familiar with the later so-called theme week era, but I grew up during the earlier era in the 70s, and it's the one where I have the most fond memories of. The format was freer and kind of more spontaneous, and he put a lot of emphasis. Of course, he always had the neighborhood of make-believe part of the show, but then he would have the real world part of the show. And in the later era, he spent a lot of those times going on field trips and showing how crayons are made or whatever. But in the earlier 70s era, he spent a lot of time going around what he called his real neighborhood, the real Mr. Rodgers' neighborhood, and in it, a lot of the characters from the neighborhood of make-believe had real-world counterparts, like Lady Aberlin was Betty Aberlin, who had Betty's Little Theater. Handyman Negri was Joe Negri with his music shop, and so on. And so he showed a lot of things of just the community, and they're doing a lot of fun things together, whether putting on a variety shows, you can see at the left, or on the lower right, supporting Chef Brockett in the opening of his new soda fountain. And it's not like he always sugarcoated everything. He talked about some pretty serious and sometimes even scary subjects on the show. He talked about death. He talked about divorce. He talked about the time he got a parking ticket and had to appear in court. In the entire history of the show, never except in this episode did he sing "It's a Beautiful Day in This Neighborhood" with such dripping sarcasm. He even talked about, in one week of shows, he even talked about the horribleness and futility of war. So he talked about some pretty strong subjects. But what I like the best is that he showed what a neighborhood should be, because the reason it was called Mr. Rodgers' Neighborhood is because it was he believed that was the unit of community, and that a neighborhood should be someone where people say hi to each other, spend time together, and truly care for and support one another. There's one song that he has that was almost never heard on the show, and yet I think it's one of his most beautiful and haunting ones too, and it goes a little bit like this. Hello there, if you are lonely, then you need only say hello there, just say hello. Just saying hello. He really believed in the power of just reaching out and making friends. And speaking of songs, I must say that his music on the show did a lot to influence my taste in music. He actually held a BA in music composition, and all the music and most of the lyrics on the show were written by him. And all of the songs, in contrast with the banality you get on a lot of children's shows, his songs are always good and meaningful. From the simple little lullaby, like the simple little lullaby he had, tree, 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 we love you, tree, 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 to some of the operas he did. He loved doing operas, and Reverend Sean mentioned John Reardon earlier, and he was often made guest appearances on the show to help the people in the neighborhood of make-believe put on operas. This one is one of my favorites, the farm opera, where Betty Aberlin is a cow named Priscilla, who's unhappy with being a cow. She wants to be groovy. And Farmer Reardon is telling her, well, have you never heard of a groovy cow, a suvy cow, a movie cow? I would like that very much. And the problem wasn't really with Priscilla. She was stuck on a farm where there were no cows, not even any other animals except the potato bugs. So I keep wondering if Fred was making a little comment here about the problem is never with us and who we are. The problem is the outside society that perhaps is not supporting us in the way that we would like. And I always found with the neighborhood of make-believe sequences that the characters were so intricate and complex. Daniel Tiger is certainly a good example. It's very easy to forget
that these are just puppets, that most of them were operated by Fred. Jim Henson's Muppets may technically be more sophisticated, but I always feel that Fred's characters are the ones that are the deepest and most profound. A good example, besides Daniel, is one of my favorite characters, Lady Elaine Fairchild. She has many different facets to her personality. Sometimes she's very mischievous and causes a lot of trouble, but there are other times when she does great things. She's an activist. She's usually the one who stands up to King Friday when he passes an unjust law. She's an astronaut, as we see her when she flew to Jupiter and discovered planet Purple. And she's also a woman of great wisdom. One of the more somber storylines in the neighborhood of make-believe in the 70s was when Mr. Allmine, who you see on the right there, who's very greedy and selfish, he actually stole Daniel's clock. And King Friday tries everything to try to persuade him to get it back, but it's Lady Elaine who finally convinces Mr. Allmine that Daniel's clock is his home, and he can't give it up any more than Mr. Allmine could give up his hair or his eyes or any part of his body. But for all these positive influences that the show had on me, and of course I could talk forever about what he did about my feelings about masculinity and that it's all right to be tender and kind. But what I wanted to focus on, and I forgot to mention, Lady Elaine is also someone who always feels good about herself. Some people may think she's ugly, but give her a mirror and she dances around with joy. So there's one episode in particular in the 70s that had a lifelong impact on me. There was one episode where he's talking about animation, and he shows various techniques for creating animated movies. He had the artist Andrew Wyeth come on and show how he used cutout animation to create the video that goes along with Fred's song, You've Got to Do It. And then he also had Maury Turner on. How many of you remember this show? It was Kid Power, which aired in the same time as Mr. Rodgers in the early days, and it was done by Maury Turner, who created the comic strip Wee Pals. And he talked with Fred about how TV shows and movies that use cell animation and the techniques that they use. And it just struck me so hard. I became really fascinated with animation. It became a hobby for me, and now it's becoming even a career for me as I transition to starting a career in computer and video game development. Which kind of brings me to the present and how I've been thinking about Mr. Rodgers lately. And I certainly have, because I don't know if you're familiar with the internet channel Twitch.com, but early this year they had a marathon to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the premiere of the show, and they showed the entire series from beginning to end. And a lot of those 70s episodes I saw them for the first time in years and years, and I was just so delighted to see it again, to see them all again. But also and then also there was the movie Won't You Be My Neighbor, and all of it made me think about my career going forward in computer graphics, and it made me realize that just as Mr. Rodgers tried to change the world by creating a good TV show to be a remedy for all the violence and slapstick on TV, I want to use computer graphics to create a more loving environment. Instead of games like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto, instead use that awesome power of computer graphics and animation to work towards building and promoting a more loving and more compassionate world. That's my vision anyway, but as Fred says in the song, you've got to do it, do it, do it, do it. And so as I start to do it, I just want to say thank you, Mr. Rodgers, for helping me so much, for helping all of us to build a hopeful vision for the future, in which all our human relations begin with our reaching out and saying, won't you be my neighbor?
So I just want to say a few more words about Mr. Rodgers. I would never have called him a radical, right? I never would have used that word with him. But Michael Long does, the guy who wrote that book. And after reading his book, I'm inclined to agree. Let me explain this. So, a radical right is someone who we often represent an extreme position of a political party, that wants to change the fundamental nature of society. Radicals can exist on both sides of the political spectrum, but the term is most often applied to the liberal side. When I think of radicals, I tend to think of those that hold views that are often in the minority of the mainstream culture. And, they might even be, people that might break laws in order to do that, right? They want a revolution. They want to change things. And I admire a lot about radicals because they often want to change the world for the better, but I admit that when I think of radicals, I tend to think of sort of very angry people. People that are strident with their opinions, they're out to change the world come hell or high water. What I don't think of when I hear the word radical is that of a soft-spoken, kind, gentle man who talks about his feelings and loving one another. But Fred Rodgers was a different kind of radical. And, not everybody grokked him. Not everybody got him. Pete Seeger referred to him as namby-pamby, right? And if you guys remember on SNL and The Tonight Show, there were parodies that went on, right? And yet, Rodgers reached, 3.5 million viewers weekly, sometimes as high as 9 million. As I've read more about him, it turns out that the radicals, people that want to upset the cultural order of things and make the world better, they come in all shapes and sizes. And for me, he was radical in 3 different ways. First, he was radical as a man. He was countercultural as a man. He went against the cultural norm that said man must be macho, with a physical strength and aggressive type of nature. Instead, his gentle, soft-spoken persona belied a different kind of strength that you don't always find in a person. It was strength of character. For example, he had a great sense of humor, and he didn't mind the jokes of Eddie Murphy and The Tonight Show. He knew kids didn't stay up that late. But as a staunch pacifist, he was adamant that he never be shown as being violent, where children could see him. So when there was some t-shirts made out of Texas that showed him holding machine guns saying, "Welcome to my hood," right? He got his lawyers on that, and he ordered that the shirts be burned. He wanted that image nowhere. I could not find it on the internet, I'm here to tell you. Now, most famous, though, was when he spoke at the Senate hearing that was held to reconsider public funding of PBS. You may have seen this on Facebook, right? So here he is, he's just 1 year into his program, and he doesn't go in railing and yelling or begging or, "Come on, you've got to do this." Instead, he uses this soft-spoken voice to earnestly and honestly tell this slick-talking senator here about the impact of television show on young children, on his television show. And he ends up winning him over. I mean, I was watching this video, I'm watching the senator, and I'm thinking, oh, this guy's not buying it at all. And at the end, he's just like, yeah, I get it. Okay. It was really interesting. He never yelled at people that he disagreed with. He would very kindly, gently, and firmly explain his position when people tried to denigrate his ideas. He said this, "Most of us, I believe, admire strength. It's something we tend to respect in others, desire for ourselves, and wish for our children. Sometimes, though, I wonder if we confuse strength with other words, like aggression and even violence. Real strength is neither male nor female, but is quite simply one of the finest characteristics that any human being can possess." And he was radical as an educator. In fact, he started his show because he wanted to change the programming nature of children's programming that was out there already. He said, "I got into television because I saw people throwing pies in each other's faces." And that's such demeaning behavior. And if there's anything that bothers me, it's one person demeaning another. He used music and song to get across very simple but profound ideas. You heard some of them today. One of the constant themes of the show was to validate and inform and affirm the importance of emotions and feelings. He said this, he said, "Confronting our feelings and giving them appropriate expression always takes strength, not weakness. It takes strength to acknowledge our anger, and sometimes more strength yet to curb the aggressive urges anger may bring, and to channel them into nonviolent outlets. It takes strength to face our sadness and to grieve and to let our grief and our anger flow in tears when they need to. It takes strength to talk about our feelings and to reach out for help and to comfort and for comfort when we need it. He continues, I'm convinced that when we help our children find healthy ways of dealing with their feelings, ways that don't hurt them or anyone else, we're helping make the world a safer, better place. And as Dave mentioned, on his show, he didn't shy away from the tough stuff. He talked about war and violence, divorce, anger, death even. And he helped kids deal with their fears. In one memorable episode, he invited Edith Hamilton, who had played the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz, because he knew kids. It was shown every year, and he knew kids were scared of her. So he had her slowly put on her outfit and everything like that, and he was like, it's just like a Halloween costume, isn't it? When he asked her to cackle like she did, he said, oh, wouldn't it be fun to talk like that? He advocated for something that is rarely taught, that is deep listening, deep thinking, and deep understanding. And most importantly, he constantly taught children the importance of kindness, compassion, and love. He would say this, there are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first way is to be kind. The second way is to be kind. The third way is to be kind. Reminds me a little bit of Howard Tucker. And finally, of course, he was a radical activist. Now, his activism wasn't what most people think of activism. Instead, he used his platform and fame to demonstrate the power of pacifism and also acceptance of everyone. Pacifism is that nonviolent goal of peace and love for all in hearts and in homes. And you can see this actually from the very outset of his TV show. In the 3 weeks prior to the start of the show, the Vietnam War was beginning to be in full swing. It was becoming clear that this was not going to end quickly. And there were the beginnings of protests. In fact, Martin Luther King had just led an anti-war march 2 weeks prior to the show airing in February 1968. The first week of his show was dedicated to peace. In fact, the first time we see the neighborhood of make-believe, right, that's his puppets here that he had there in his neighborhood of make-believe, there is a war going on. Though no one wants war, the people are still preparing for it. And Lady Aberlin helps end the war with the help of Mr. Rodgers by creating balloons with signs on them that say love, peace, tenderness, etc. on them. The balloons are then launched at those fighting, and everyone agrees that they should stop. Now that's the very short version. It's actually a very complex thing in which he walks children through to understand that peace isn't easy. It's actually quite hard. But it takes creativity and it takes listening. Isn't peace wonderful? That's what he asks his audience. Now, often his radical beliefs were beliefs in the dignity and worth of all people. That was simply to show people counter to the popular cultural images. So, for example, he countered Nixon's portrayal of poor people as lazy and said he depicted them the opposite on his show. And another famous moment was when during a time when there was the segregation of whites and blacks, particularly around swimming pools, right? He invited Officer Clemens, the same one that we heard about in our reading, to join him in dipping their feet in a pool together. And by the way, Clemens was concerned about playing a black police officer because after all, blacks didn't have good experience with police officers at that time, didn't have a great reputation. And Rodgers simply said, that's exactly why you need to play him. His most famous advice for kids, most of you remember, I'm sure you've seen this maybe on Facebook or out there, was, look for the helpers, right? Well, what most people don't know about that actually was a public service announcement that was made in direct opposition to then President Bush's war on terror. Rodgers was a man of deep convictions who tried to help children be loved just as they are and to also to love others just as they are. Why does it surprise us so much that someone who is gentle and soft-spoken is a radical? particularly when it's the soft-spoken ones that have often changed the world. They're called subversive radicals, right? They're subversive because you don't expect it with their soft, kind manner that they're going to change you. You're so open to them because of their nature, you don't realize how radical they are. And history is full of famous subversive radicals. I'm sure you all have heard of Gandhi. There's a subversive, peaceful radical, and he definitely had an influence on Fred Rodgers. Another subversive radical with a definite big influence on Rodgers was Jesus of Nazareth. This is how he viewed Jesus. Rodgers believed that Jesus was a gentle subversive who advocated to love thy neighbor and sought to emulate him. You may not know this, but he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He knew the story of Jesus and thought to teach the Jesus that he knew through his television show, though he never once mentions Jesus. He fervently believed in a God who accepts us as we are and loves us unconditionally, who is present in each person and all of creation, who desires a peaceful and whole world. In other words, he was a devout Universalist. Our job, according to Rodgers, was to love as God loves, don't give up on others, and accept them just as they are. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "What a tough job to try to communicate the gift of Jesus to anybody. It can't be simply talked about, can it? Jesus himself used parables, so I guess that's our directive. Try to show the kingdom of God through stories as much as possible." Like Jesus, he was a storytelling peacemaker, and he did it every week without ever mentioning Jesus. The most radical message he gave was one that every Unitarian Universalist. I love you just as you are, right? Our third principle states that we affirm and promote acceptance of one another. That's exactly what he believed was God's message to us all, and he was one of the messengers. He said everyone longs to be loved and longs to know that he or she is capable of loving, and that this is how the divine shows up in us. Like in our song, so many children grow up thinking that they're a mistake, whether it's because they're soft-spoken and shy, or gay, or poor, or whatever way they might think that they are different. But in Mr. Rodgers' neighborhood, everyone was loved just as they are. And I love this. He said, when I say it's you I like, I'm talking about that part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. Rodgers' love for everyone was as radical as it gets. Mr. Rodgers passed away in 2003. You know, at the end of every show, he would say this. He'd say, "You've made this a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are." So, Mr. Rodgers, if you're listening, we'd like to say, you've made this a special day here at OCUC by your just being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and we like you just the way you are. Blessed be, shalom, and amen. Let us